All right. Well, it's been about 2 weeks since we've been in the book of 1 Kings, but we have the opportunity now to get back into the book of 1 Kings. Before we do, I do want to say thank you. The love and the generosity of the congregation is greatly appreciated. That was very generous of y'all, and we thank y'all very much. Really appreciate it very much. It's so wonderful to be part of such a loving and caring congregation, so we thank y'all. It did sidetrack us. Man, I forgot to get my mic. I forgot to get a lot of things, but here we are. Now my phone's not picking up the proclaim, so I'm just going to go ahead and use this. Oh, this. Got to turn this on. Yeah, I'll just have us thrown for a loop, I'll tell you what. All right, here we go. Thank y'all. We're very appreciative of each and every one of y'all. Very generous and very thankful for it. So, back in the book of 1 Kings, it's been a little while since we have been in Kings. We had the opportunity to have a prayer service, which is always very uplifting and very encouraging. Then we had the opportunity to have a singing service as well, so that was also another wonderful opportunity, and I'm so thankful for those fifth Wednesdays. So we've had 2 weeks away from 1 Kings, and now we're jumping back into 1 Kings, so we'll kind of have a little bit of a recap just to remind us where we are as it pertains to chapter 4 of 1 Kings. And I think we had actually gotten to about verse 26 in 1 Kings chapter 4, and we're in that section titled Solomon the Wise. Just to kind of refresh our minds, you know, when you come to Scripture, there's sometimes some chapters in Scripture you'll get to and you'll look at and you'll be like, okay, there's a whole lot of information, there's a whole lot of details, but what does this mean for the 21st century Christian today? What can I really pull from this, and what's the major application that I can see from this text? Well, 1 Kings chapter 4 is one of those. When you first get to it and you look at the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 4, and you look at this list of names that are found within this chapter, especially, you're like, okay, should I just breeze right past this and continue on to the next, or should I look at some of the details within this text? Well, I hope that what we see as we move through 1 Kings chapter 4 will really be highlighted at the end of the chapter, but basically something I think we need to have in mind is the riches and the wisdom and the growth of this kingdom. Now remember, this is something that God has established through David all the way to Solomon. It's a kingdom that God has established. And He has given Solomon this great wisdom. And because of these things, it's being seen by all those in the land around them. Well, you move into chapter 4, and the first thing you see is all these names, and you see this administration of Solomon's kingdom. And these individuals that are very close to his own household, and then it starts expanding out a little bit further. And you see even these who are governing over these different parts of all of the kingdom, right? Well, these governors have these specific responsibilities, and we began to see that as we worked through 1 Kings chapter 4. As a matter of fact, we even started seeing how greatly the borders of the kingdom had expanded, and I put a picture up here just as a reminder. This was the tribes, the different land allotments that were given to the tribes, and you see kind of the size of it. Well, by the time you have King Solomon in and reigning, this is how much this nation has grown. This is how much more land that they actually have acquired and they are actually governing over, and you have all of these different governors who are taking care of their own area, and then we actually looked at what they were sending in to King Solomon. And the 12 governors that are listed, each one of them are sending this 1 month's supply a year to King Solomon. And the numbers were mind-blowing. Equivalent to 28,000 pounds of bread that could be cooked from what they were sending them a month. Or daily provisions, excuse me. 21,000 pounds of meat that was being sent to them. This is the food that is coming into Solomon's household on a daily basis, and this is what these individuals who are governing these areas, that's what they're supplying. Now, as we move into the text, what we're going to recognize is that even on top of what they are sending to Solomon's household, guess what? There was no lack in any supply. Could you imagine having enough stuff, enough supplies, enough goods to send this much to the king, and yet still have plenty to feed your own families? You see, the picture that's being painted as it pertains to the kingdom, this kingdom where Solomon is reigning over at this moment, is a picture of a kingdom that is wealthy beyond measure. You know, a few verses to remember, even verse 20 of 1 Kings chapter 4. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sands by the sea in the multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. You think back to Genesis and the promises that were made to Abraham considering this nation. You're seeing the fulfillment of these promises that were given even to Abraham. And you look at verse 25, just about where we left off, and it says, "And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all of the days of Solomon." Now, this saying that is within verse 25 is somewhat proverbial, and it carries the idea of there is this tranquility, there is this peace, there is this great abundance of everything that you need, and every man has it. That's the image of the kingdom at this time. Keep that in mind as we work through the text, as we continue to build this understanding of just how great this kingdom was at this time. Let's pick back up there at verse 26. This was the last verse that we read, and it's kind of one of these little brief insights to maybe a little bit of fault on Solomon's part here. If you look at verse 26 in 1 Kings 4, it says Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Now, we noted Deuteronomy chapter 17, and where it mentions, do not collect up for yourselves horses. This was something for the kings, not to collect up for themselves horses. It sounds like he's somewhat collecting up horses, right? A lot of them. Maybe this is one of his minor downfalls early on. That's what most believe. Who here hasn't made a few mistakes along the way, right? It's not really emphasized too much here, but it is something that he's begun to do that is not right in the sight of God. But it kind of jumps right from that, and you look at verse 27, and it shifts gears and changes the focus right back to these governors. And that's kind of where it was 10 verses back, mentioning these individual 12 governors. Verse 27, it says, "And these governors, each man in his month, provided food for the King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table. There was no lack in their supplies." Continue to think about the things that are stated as it pertains to this kingdom. They weren't lacking anything. They had everything in abundance. When you move into the next chapter and you start looking at how the temple is built and what they used to build the temple, you will also see that they had no lack in funds. There was no lack of anything. There was peace on all sides. There was no wars. There was no fighting. There was no concern really about anything. That sounds absolutely amazing, doesn't it? Well, let's continue to look at what the text has to say about this kingdom. Look at verse 28. This is kind of interesting. It throws in, they also brought barley and straw to the proper place for the horses and steeds, each man according to his charge. Now, it's not only the case that, of course, there's plenty enough for everybody, there's also plenty enough for the horses, right? They're getting everything that they need, and they're being fed well, even just as everybody else as it pertains to this kingdom. All right. Now, we turn back and shift and look again at this wisdom that was given to Solomon. If somebody will, read verse 29 through 31 for us.
"And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding, and largest in heart, like the sand of the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the
Ezrahite.
Yeah, and Heman.
Charcoal. I just got this look from Jesse, like, why did you ask somebody to read this text? Darda, the sons of Mahol.
Yeah, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations.
Those weren't the worst names. There's a lot worse names. It could have been much worse. I understand.
Charcoal. He-Man the charcoal.
So we have these individuals that are listed, but what's important to notice right there at the beginning of that reading God gave Solomon this wisdom. Again, it turns the focus toward where this source of wisdom has actually come from. And now, you think about everything that's been said about this kingdom, and the great abundance, and they're lacking nothing, and the riches, and all of this, and it all points back to the wisdom of God. And it's wisdom that Solomon received from God. Well, most try and explain this in the sense that it signifies even to practical wisdom. Your everyday responsibilities, your decision-making that is best for all of the people, judicial knowledge, all of these things. Remember, he wanted to be able to judge the people and judge them rightly. But what we're going to see as we work through the text, it goes far beyond just that kind of knowledge. What we'll see toward the latter part is pretty much, the latter part of this chapter is his knowledge pretty well covers all of God's creation in all aspects. He has knowledge and understanding of all of these things. And it goes on to add in this largeness of heart. You know, when we associate the heart typically in modern terms, we'll think about the heart in the sense of emotion. We'll think about it as feelings or things of that nature. Now, in ancient times, this largeness of heart, this was more of what would describe the very core of a man. His character, his intellect, his anything, personality, anything that governs an individual to drive them to do the things that they do. Basically, that's the heart of a man, the very core of his being. And it says it gives him largeness of heart. It'll go on to describe it in the sense of that like the sands of the seashore. Immeasurable. This is the knowledge of this king, Solomon, who is leading God's people. There's no way really to measure the knowledge that God has given him. And it extends far beyond what Solomon originally asked for in this ability to judge the people. Well, verse 30, Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. You know, there was a long-standing tradition of those of the East as well as Egypt who were these incredibly smart, these incredibly intelligent individuals. And even in their time, the things that they were able to do, you think about the Egyptians and much of what they were actually able to accomplish in their time, you know, in their heyday, if you will, they've always been recognized as very intelligent individuals. Well, even in this, it's recognizing Solomon to excel far beyond anything that anybody else had ever even had in it as it pertains to wisdom. You know, one of the commentators that I read, he said his knowledge exceeds those who were celebrated as experts in the area of geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and astrology. You think about these people that are spoke of, these of the East and the Egyptians, that's some of the things that they were known for in their time. Not just your regular everyday knowledge. The knowledge that God gave Solomon far exceeds anything that he had ever asked for, and it exceeds into all aspects of life. How does this kingdom get to the point where it's at? This knowledge that God gave to Solomon. Yes, sir.
I find it interesting thinking back even to verse 20, where it talks about Judah and Israel being as numerous as the sand by the sea, and then thinking now about the way that his wisdom, his understanding, and his heart are described. Mm-hmm. Now, you want a leader that's going to have the wisdom, the understanding, the heart that's big enough for those who he leads, and Solomon clearly has that.
Right. He has every attribute that a leader needs to have to be able to lead a nation and to lead them well. You know, not even only in the sense of leading them well, but also truly caring about the people. You know, his request originally and the wisdom that he wanted was not necessarily just for him, but rather it was a reflection of his care about God's people and how it was that he was going to be able to lead them and to lead them efficiently, right? To give them the best life as they could actually have, you know, from him and being a king in his standpoint. But it goes on and it keeps explaining, and we'll keep having these little, you know, mentions of this wisdom that God gave to Solomon, and it continues to remind us throughout the next several chapters. It continues to emphasize this knowledge that he has. Well, you get to verse 31, and now it's going to get a little bit more specific. You have these different areas, all of those of the East as well as those of Egypt, and then 31, it goes more specific. And it mentions that he is wiser than all men, but then it says that than Ethan, the Ezrahite, Heman, Chalcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. Now, we don't have just a whole lot of information about these individuals. You could actually go to the Psalms, Psalm 88, and what you'll see within that psalm is it says a contemplation of Heman. If you look at Psalm 89, you'll see it says a contemplation of Ethan. So both of these men were ones who actually wrote psalms. They are within our psalms that we have in our Bible that you can go and you can read. They were recognized as very sharp, very wise individuals, even as it pertains to music. Some of these are actually recognized as within the lineage of Samuel, the prophet. One of them is actually seen as, or all of them are actually seen tying back to Judah and Tamar, if you start tracing out their lineage. These are people that would have been well known in that time. We don't know a lot about them now, but one thing that they were known for in their time was their wisdom. And it says Solomon's far exceeded the wisdom that they had. And all of this given by God to Solomon. Now, continue working through the text, and hopefully as we collect all this information, we'll be able to drive a good point of application at the end. But somebody, if you will, read verse 32 and 33.
He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Also he spoke of trees from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish.
Thank you, sir. Wisdom that was recorded then that they could appreciate, wisdom that's still recorded and that we can appreciate today. You think about all the writings that we have that came from Solomon, right? And we recognize them as wisdom writings, right? That's what we look to them for. You think about Ecclesiastes, you think about Songs of Solomon, you think about Proverbs. All of these writings, and it's showing that there is a vast number of these writings that, Solomon had actually written down his thoughts, providing his knowledge even for other people to read then. And guess what? We can still look to those things and we can read much of his writing just the same today. The knowledge God has given him, even provided for us. And you go on to verse 33, and here's where it shows kind of the vast nature of the wisdom that God gave him. He spoke of trees from the cedar trees of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. The cedar trees of Lebanon were some of the greatest trees of that time, and that's where, of course, he's going to turn to have timber sent to build the temple. These were massive trees, and they produced lots of lumber, and it was a very thick and fruitful forest there in Lebanon. And he points to this, and it's talking about, okay, well, he had knowledge about these all the way from those trees that are so vast to this little bitty kind of bush, I guess, if you will, that grows out of the walls. From this small little plant, almost of nothing, to the greatest trees of Lebanon. And then it says he even has understanding as it pertains to animals, of birds, creeping things, and of fish. God gave him knowledge of everything of his creation, the way it sounds. And he put his knowledge down even for them to read in that time, the generations to come, and we still have it today. An extremely wise man, wiser than anybody else of his time. And because of that, this kingdom is where it's at. God has allowed them to get to this position and to this rank, if you will, in wealth, in superiority in all things almost, in wisdom. In verse 34 it says, and all men and men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. His fame has spread to the point that people are coming from all directions. Now, when we get to 1 Kings chapter 10, you'll see an illustration of this. The queen of Sheba, 1,200 miles her journey to come just to see if these things are true. If the knowledge and the wisdom that she has heard about as it pertains to Solomon and his wealth, 1,200 miles. Look, they didn't have social media. They didn't have internet. They didn't have TV. They didn't have all of this stuff to help show what's going on, 1,200 miles away. This was traveling by word of mouth. Well, verse 34 is the beginning of this, of people coming from all different directions to hear, to see, to experience the wisdom of Solomon. It's almost to the point like it's unbelievable, and they have to come for themselves to say, you know what, I want to see this for myself if I'm truly going to believe this. Well, as it pertains even back to chapter 3 and chapter 4 of 1 Kings, you see an image of a kingdom that is almost unbelievable. You see a kingdom that is so vast, that is so wealthy, that is experiencing peace and joy to the point that every man has everything in great abundance. Do you see the picture of how staggering this kingdom that God gave to Solomon is? It's a kingdom that's full of wisdom, it's full of riches, peace, joy, happiness, rest. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be a citizen within this kingdom? We have it pretty good today, don't get me wrong. I mean, we have so many things that are so far advanced from their time. But really, if you read through chapter 4 and you think about how great it was in that time and what it must have been like to experience that life. I mean, they're not having to worry about their government. They're not worried about money. They're not worried about the economy. They're not worried about supply of food. They're not worried about anything. They're not worried about the nations that surround them and what they might be plotting against their nation. They have no worries whatsoever. Now, we went to a text in the previous class, and I'm going to go back to it again as we close this chapter. I want us to listen to something that Jesus said while he was teaching those who refused to believe him unless a sign was given to them. Look at Matthew chapter 12 and verse 42. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 42. Now Jesus is speaking to the scribes and to the Pharisees. And they say basically to Jesus, look, here's what we need you to do if we're going to believe you. We need you to give us some sort of sign. Which is kind of comical, right? What had Jesus been doing? Signs, wonders, miracles, all these things. They had everything that they needed to know for a fact, without a shadow of doubt, that Jesus Christ was indeed the Son of God and came with the power of God. Yet they say, you know what, here's what we need. We need a sign from you if we're going to believe you. Jesus says in verse 42 of chapter 12 there in Matthew, the queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. That last statement in that text, indeed one greater than Solomon is here. You know, Jesus tried to come and talk to them about this kingdom that was coming. And he tried to express to them the reality of the spiritual blessings that came with that kingdom. And basically, it's almost like the people heard it and they're like, oh yeah, so you're a king? Yeah, that's great. You got a kingdom that's coming? Well, that's great. Show us a sign. Show us a miracle. Then maybe we'll believe you. He points back to Solomon. And he points back to this queen of the south, this queen of Sheba, who travels 1,200 miles to come and see him. And we'll see that when we get to chapter 10. She went across the known world to be in the presence of Solomon. And then Jesus says, you know what? There's one greater than him now before you. And you think about the kingdom that he supplies. The kingdom that came because of his sacrifice. To what ends? To what measure? What will we do to gain that kingdom? You think about this kingdom and you can't fully appreciate what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 42 until you go back and you look at chapters like 1 Kings chapter 4. Yes, it's a bunch of information, it's a bunch of details, and when you read through it, sometimes maybe you say, you know what, I'm just going to read right through this and go on to something else because I don't know exactly how that applies to me today. It's just a narrative, it's just this information. It is painting a picture of a kingdom that is so vast, a kingdom that is so great, that all people all around it are flooding to it and they want to experience this life that they have there in the reign of King Solomon. And Jesus says, guess what? The queen of the south is going to rise up in the judgment and condemn y'all. She traveled 1,200 miles. Guess what? They didn't have to go anywhere. Jesus came to them. You ever think about what Jesus has done for us in providing us this avenue of salvation? To what measures God took to get this plan of salvation to us? It's right in front of our face. He's given it to us. He's served it up on a silver platter. And Jesus is saying, look, here it is. You think the wisdom of Solomon was something great? Jesus Christ is the very wisdom of God standing right before them. You're a king? Oh, that's great. You got a kingdom coming? Well, that's wonderful. Give me a sign. Give me a miracle. Sometimes we overlook the greatest things that are right in front of us. Jesus is trying to remind them, look, there's someone that is so much greater than him. You look at that chapter and you see all these details, you know, and you walk away from it. Sometimes in texts like that, you think, man, how does this apply today? All men from all nations, from all kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. You know, you see the signs and the things as it is this time of the year, right up there on 37. I think one of those signs, and it has, of course, the 3 wise men, and there's a sign out there that says, wise men still seek him today. Now, there's some truth to that part, isn't there? Wise men still seek him today. How much effort will you put forth to truly seek him, to know him, to be known by him? He's done absolutely everything, all the way to the point of giving his own son and Jesus the Christ coming and sacrificing his own life so that we can have eternal salvation. That's one of the lessons we can take from 1 Kings chapter 4. Yes, it was a beautiful kingdom, but it pales in comparison. It's nothing even remotely similar as it pertains to the kingdom that Jesus Christ offers. Okay. Let's move into chapter 5. Any questions, thoughts before we move into chapter 5?
That chapter is a great reminder to us of when we look at the Old Testament, what lens we need to view it through. Mm-hmm. Because everything there is pointing forward. You know, we may have to look a little harder at times, but we lose out if we don't see the things like chapter 4 mm-hmm. in relation to Christ, to the kingdom, of the gospel, even, you know, through all of that history, Joshua, Moses, mm-hmm. The glory of the kingdom to come, the cost of not following, the reward of following. You know, we really need to look harder when we look at the Old Testament, because that's a lot of, you know, when we're told the things written aforetime were written for our learning. Well, mm-hmm. It's more than just a history lesson. Right.
Absolutely. If you couldn't hear Chris, you know, he's talking about having, you know, the proper mindset even when going to the Old Testament. It's more than just the history, as sometimes we look at it. There is so much within the Old Testament that helps provide us these valuable lessons and illustrations that we can learn, and you have to be looking at the Old Testament through the right lens to really catch that. You know, there's so much in the book of Leviticus, these types that point to the Christ. There are so many shadows that you see through the Old Testament that ultimately when you see the fulfillment in things in the New Testament, you know, like the Hebrew writer wrote about, if you look at it through the right lens, there are so many valuable lessons that can be found through the Old Testament. And it's so much more than just little bits of information and details that you think, why in the world is all of this here? You know? Yes, sir.
Yeah, to that same point is that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed in the Old Testament, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed.
The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed.
God's plan is now revealed through the New Testament.
Yeah.
Of what was concealed in the Old Testament, because
right.
even the people in the Old Testament didn't understand. You know, for us, 2,000 years later, it has a whole different meaning than this stuff would have to those Jewish people that have been studying this all their lives, this is how they learned to read and write. This is how they learned, was by memorizing these Old Testament passages and these things that they've been waiting for 1,000 years
Right.
to come about. And then they were in the day when it was coming about
Yeah. And still didn't realize it.
and still didn't get
Yes.
it. And I find this amazing with Solomon that I forget where it says it, but there's all these books that he written, all these huge volumes of stuff that were lost. You know, but when you look at it, Solomon may have been wise, but as you were saying, that's the wisdom of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have nothing that God didn't give him.
Yeah.
And it's the same with us. Our true wisdom can be found in how much we put our focus and our minds into following God.
Right. You know, it's a physical representation almost of a spiritual kingdom that is coming. You know, you think about even the parables. What's the definition that we give those? It's a earthly story with a heavenly spiritual meaning or something of that nature. I mean, if you look to this kingdom that was established and Solomon reigned over, it is this physical representation of this great and mighty kingdom, wealthy and prosperous and experiencing peace on all sides, and you point toward the spiritual. Right? Ties very uniquely, just like a parable in a sense when you think about it in that fashion. And it's kind of having the mindset when you go through the Old Testament that everything in the Old Testament is ultimately pointing to Christ. It's the history of God's creation and man, but ultimately it is leading to Jesus the Christ. And when you look at it in that sense, there's very valuable lessons that can be found. Very valuable lessons. Okay. All right, let's move to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is going to get us into what I have listed. Chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 7 and verse 51, these building projects. You know, there were certain responsibilities that Solomon knew that he had coming into reigning as a king that he needed to take care of. And we'll see the building of the temple. That was one of the things that David wanted to do himself, of course, but he wasn't able to. Remember why? Right? Man of war, right? That's what was said. And he wanted to do it. And then ultimately, you know, he received word from God. You're a man of war. You're not going to be the one that builds this temple, but rather one that comes from your seed, pointing to Solomon. So we're fixing to see the beginning of these building projects. And again, as you move through this, there's going to be a lot of detail once we get to chapter 6 as it pertains to the temple. And by the time you get through chapter 6 and this temple is built, the worth of this temple and the fine detail even coming into chapter 7 of everything that goes into this build. I can't help but to think again, these details are there for a reason. These details are showing us this physical representation of this temple, but yet there's something far greater, something far, far greater. Well, chapter 5 is the beginning of the preparation for the build of the temple. And we'll go ahead and we'll read there in chapter 5. If someone will, just read chapter 5 and verse 1.
Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servant to Solomon, because he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram had always loved David. Then Solomon said to Hiram, saying,
Oh, you're good, you're good. It's interesting here that this Hiram, king of Tyre, he has received word. Now remember, do y'all remember in David's reign that Hiram and David actually had a relationship, and he had actually helped supply him lumber for his house, right? So there was this relationship that was already shared with David and with Hiram. And once he hears that Solomon has actually been placed as king, he basically sends words of congratulation. He's excited for the fact that Solomon is now reigning over the kingdom. And he sends word to Solomon. Now, Tyre, as you work through the Bible, this is kind of a unique time for them, and there's this good relationship that is shared between Tyre and between God's people. Now, by the time that you get to King Ahab, and you think about Sidon and Tyre are both right there close together and are all kind of the same people. Ultimately, that's where Jezebel comes from. And you say the name Jezebel, and it automatically kind of gives you this bad feeling, right? That's where she comes from. There's a point, though, when the relationships that they shared were really good, and this is part of it, where as soon as he hears about Solomon being king, he wants to send this word of praise toward Solomon. Now, just another type that you could kind of point back toward the New Testament. You think about the kingdom that Jesus has provided that would cause Gentiles to praise the Lord. What is Hiram? Gentile, pagan nation. What we'll see as we work through the text is that these Gentiles take part in helping provide lumber and material for the temple of God, and that they praise the Lord even as we work through this text. Just another type or connection that you can make even to the New Testament kingdom. Verse 2, it says, Then Solomon sent to Hiram, saying, You know my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which he fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. Now, we've seen mention of this again and again as you work through Samuel in the Davidic promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7. We've already seen mention of it with Solomon a few times here in the Kings, but David wasn't able to build this house for the Lord. It was going to be Solomon, and now Solomon is saying the same things that we've actually been reading. Verse 4, it says, But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. And behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. As the Lord spoke to my father David, saying, Your son whom I will set on your throne in your place, he shall build the house for my name. Now therefore, command that they cut down cedars for me from Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants, and I will pay your wages for your servants according to whatever you say. For you know there is none among us who has skill to cut timber like the Sidonians. He's pointing to them and he's saying, look, y'all have a special ability that nobody else in the area has. And just side note, if y'all didn't know, this was the first Home Depot, the Lebanon Home Depot, right? This is always where people go to for lumber. And immediately what you see Solomon in this opportunity, King of Tyre, he reaches out to Solomon and he says, congratulations, right? We're so glad that you're there reigning as king, essentially. And then he says, okay, well, here's what I would like if we could make this happen. And he begins to explain to him the things that were told to him and why it is that he's going to build this temple. And he says, here's what I need if you're willing. Now, Tyre is a little bitty, small city. It's actually, I was going to put it on a map up here, and I realized once I zoomed in far enough to actually hone in on Tyre, you wouldn't even be able to tell what it was you were looking at on the map. It's not all that big as far as Tyre, but they were right there at the mountains and the Lebanon forest, and this is where all building material came, even for David's household. So immediately Solomon is offering up this opportunity for Hiram to have this same relationship with him. So if you look at verse 7, so it was when Hiram heard the words of Solomon that he rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people. Now that's something worth noting, that this pagan nation king, this Gentile king, is turning and saying, Blessed be the Lord this day. A kingdom that brings about Gentiles praising God's name. Verse 8, Then Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the message which you sent to me, and I will do all you desire concerning the cedar and the cypress logs. My servants shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea. I will float them in rafts by the sea to the place you indicate to me, and I will have them broken apart there. Then you can take them away, and you shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household. You read through this text, and it really seems like this is not all that much work, not all that much effort being put forth to make this happen. The name Tyre is actually, I think it means the rock. This was an extremely rocky terrain lining this mountain-type region. And you have this forest, the Lebanon forest, and they're cutting these great big timbers down, and they're going to take them out to the to the sea, and they're going to float them down, and then they're going to move them over to Jerusalem. You know, doing work out there on Lake Cypress, there were times where it was better for us, as far as manpower, to float material in. Now, you know how much of a hassle it is when you start trying to drag these bundles of wet lumber up on the bank, and you're tugging and you're pulling, and everybody's down there in the water. You know, there was some of the material that we used, there were times where we had to tie buoys to the material because it was so heavy it would sink. It didn't actually float. 6x6s that were around 30 foot long, and you tie these little buoys to them, and the buoys would be sticking up out of the water, and you couldn't even see the timber. It's a hard job. And this king immediately says, you know what? Yeah, we're on board. We're going to help you out with this. And we're going to take these timbers, and we're going to make rafts, and we're going to float them. It's like 120-something miles, to my understanding, is what they're moving this stuff. And they say, yeah, we'll do this. We're on board. Now, remember, God had told Solomon, you're going to have peace on all sides. Things are going to be real good. God's word's being fulfilled. And now even the Gentiles are taking part in helping provide this lumber to get the temple built. He wants in return, verse 9, by giving food for my household. Now, we'll get to that probably in our next class. The bells, I think, is fixing to ring on me. I haven't even calculated yet, you know, the quantity of what this, you know, equals up to today. But remember, if you look down to verse 11, it says, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat. Just to get a number in your mind, a core is about a donkey load. 20,000 donkey loads of wheat. Appreciate your attention. We'll get into that next week.